The summer sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows over the garden, where the wedding reception was in full swing. Guests in elegant attire milled about, their laughter and conversation blending with the soft strains of a string quartet. The scent of freshly cut flowers, mingled with the warmth of the evening air, created a setting that felt almost too perfect. Yet beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension was beginning to stir, unnoticed by most. He stood near the edge of the crowd, drink in hand, his eyes scanning the scene before him. The man had always been one for observation, preferring to linger on the outskirts of events like these, watching the interactions of others with a quiet, almost analytical interest. It had been a whirlwind of a day, his wedding day, no less. And though he had done his best to focus on his bride and their new life together, a vague sense of disconnection had settled in his chest. It wasn't coldness exactly, but something was amiss, something he couldn't yet name. And then, in the midst of the crowd, his gaze fell upon him, his new brother-in-law. The man hadn't had much time to get to know his wife's family before the wedding. There had been brief introductions, a few dinners, but nothing that had truly cemented his understanding of her relatives. He knew her brother only through stories, glimpses in passing, a name spoken with fondness. He had not anticipated this moment, this encounter that would shake the very ground beneath him. There he was, standing near a cluster of guests, tall and striking. His dark hair fell slightly into his eyes, which gleamed with a kind of intensity that draws people in without them even realizing it. He wasn't dressed in a traditional sense of elegance. His suit, though well-fitted, seemed almost casually worn, as though he had stepped into the formality out of necessity rather than choice. There was a certain nonchalance about him that made it clear he didn't care for the pomp and circumstance of the day. His posture was relaxed, a stark contrast to the nervous energy that surrounded most of the wedding guests. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The man couldn't take his eyes off him. He noticed the subtle movements, the way his fingers tapped lightly against his glass, the way he smiled in that half-hearted, almost secretive way as someone told a joke nearby. There was an allure to him, something magnetic, something that stirred a curiosity deep within. Without thinking, the man found himself moving through the crowd, his feet carrying him toward his brother-in-law, as if drawn by an invisible thread. He wasn't entirely sure why. He had spoken with him earlier, exchanged the usual pleasantries, but nothing more. Yet now, there was an inexplicable pull, a need to be closer. As he approached, the brother-in-law's eyes flicked up, meeting his own. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by something else, an awareness perhaps. The moment stretched out between them, filled with a charged silence. Neither spoke at first. The sounds of the reception faded into the background, leaving only the quiet tension between them, like the calm before a storm. The man opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he found himself caught in those eyes, their dark depths betraying more than politeness. It wasn't an obvious look, not something anyone else would have noticed, but to him in that moment, it felt like a spark, a glimmer of something unspoken, something dangerous. Finally, his brother-in-law broke the silence. "Congratulations," he said, his voice smooth and low, though his tone lacked the forced enthusiasm that often accompanies such greetings. There was no trace of insincerity. Yet there was something else there, too. Something that made the man's pulse quicken. "Thank you," he replied, his voice sounding more steady than he felt. He wanted to say more, to continue the conversation, but the words were elusive. What was it about this man that had him so off balance? They barely knew each other. Yet there was a familiarity in the air between them, as though they had shared something already, something beyond the confines of familial duty. The brother-in-law glanced around the garden, his gaze briefly lingering on the guests before returning to the man. "Quite the event," he remarked, his lips curving into that same half-smile. "Not really my scene, though." The man nodded, understanding more than he was willing to admit. "Yeah, mine either." And there it was, an unspoken connection. It wasn't in the words they exchanged, but in the silences between them, in the glances that lingered just a second too long, in the way they both seemed to feel out of place amidst the grandeur of the occasion. They were kindred spirits, even if they didn't yet realize what that meant. For the rest of the evening, the man found himself unable to shake the feeling that had settled over him. He watched his wife's brother from a distance, not out of suspicion or distrust, but out of fascination. There was something about him, something that tugged at the edges of his consciousness, demanding attention. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was deeper, more complex, a feeling that stirred a strange combination of excitement and dread within him. As the night wore on, the encounters between them became more frequent, brief moments where their paths crossed, each one leaving the man more unsettled than the last. Each time they spoke, there was a tension in the air, a crackling energy that neither could quite explain but both felt acutely. By the time the evening drew to a close, the man was left with more questions than answers. Who was this person really? And why did he feel so drawn to him, as though they were on the verge of something profound, something that could change everything? As he lay in bed that night, his new wife sleeping soundly beside him, he couldn't help but replay the day's events in his mind, fixating on those brief moments, those fleeting glances. He didn't know what it all meant, but one thing was certain. This encounter had awakened something in him, something that would not easily be forgotten. And though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning. The days following the wedding blurred together in a routine of newlywed life, dinners, social obligations, the settling into the rhythm of marriage. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. His wife was attentive, their home peaceful, their friends congratulatory. Yet beneath this facade of contentment, something darker was growing, something he couldn't control. It began with fleeting thoughts, innocent at first, but rapidly gaining intensity. The son-in-law would enter his mind at the most unexpected moments. A sudden flash of his smile while the man was working at his desk, the memory of his quiet presence at family gatherings, or the way he had lingered in conversation that first night. These thoughts, though disturbing, were impossible to dismiss. The more he tried to push them away, the stronger they became, weaving themselves into his consciousness like an insidious whisper. Every family event became an ordeal of restraint. When the brother-in-law entered the room, the man's senses heightened. His heart would race, his skin prickling with an awareness that made every glance, every movement between them, feel like a secret exchange. Though they barely spoke, their silence carried an unspoken weight. The man could feel it in the way the air shifted when they were near each other, the electric charge that crackled just beneath the surface, threatening to erupt at any moment. It wasn't physical proximity that stirred the desire, but rather the space between them. Every stolen glance felt like a brush of the hand, every accidental touch an electric shock that jolted him into a state of heightened awareness. And always there was that underlying fear. Fear of what these feelings meant, fear of discovery, fear of crossing a line that would be impossible to uncross. There were moments when the man would catch himself staring too long, his eyes tracing the lines of his brother-in-law's face, his hands, his movements. It was maddening, the way his attention drifted toward him without permission, like a compass forever turning north. He had never felt anything like this before. This uncontrollable pull that defied logic, defied morality. It wasn't just desire. It was an obsession, an ache that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. He tried to avoid him, to keep a safe distance, but it was futile. At every gathering, every family dinner, their paths would cross. And every time, it became harder to pretend that nothing was wrong, harder to suppress the feelings that raged beneath his calm exterior. The man began to notice small things, how his brother-in-law's gaze would linger just a little too long on him, how their fingers would graze when passing something at the dinner table. These tiny, almost imperceptible moments felt like fireworks in his chest, igniting a fire he knew he shouldn't let burn. When they were alone in the same room, even for a brief moment, the tension was unbearable. The silence between them would stretch thin, taut with unspoken emotions. Neither of them dared to acknowledge what was happening, yet both were acutely aware. It was there in the way they avoided looking directly at each other, in the sharpness of their breath when they passed too closely. On one occasion, during a family barbecue, the man had wandered into the house, seeking a moment of solitude. He stood in the quiet kitchen, his thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion and desire, when he felt the presence behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. His body reacted before his mind did, his pulse quickening, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment they stood there, the tension hanging between them like a veil. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He could feel the heat of his brother-in-law's body behind him, the charged air filling the small space. He closed his eyes, gripping the countertop as though it could ground him, keep him from spiraling into something he couldn't control. The silence stretched, heavy and intoxicating, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, his brother-in-law turned and left the room without a word. But the moment lingered, long after he had gone, like the echo of a touch that never happened. It was enough to leave the man shaken, his mind reeling from the intensity of his own emotions. At night, as he lay next to his wife, the weight of his desire pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. He felt trapped, torn between the life he had built and the impossible feelings that threatened to unravel it. His thoughts drifted to his brother-in-law, to the way he had felt in that kitchen, the proximity of him, the unspoken tension that had left him breathless. It was wrong. He knew that, but no matter how much he tried to push the desire away, it only grew stronger, more insistent. The man was no longer in control. He had crossed a threshold, stepping into a space where desire ruled over reason, where the forbidden felt more alluring than anything he had ever known. And though he knew he was on the edge of something dangerous, something that could destroy everything, he couldn't turn back. The desire had taken root, deep and unshakable, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it consumed him completely. The summer evening was slipping into night, the reception for yet another family event beginning to wind down. Lanterns hanging from the trees cast a warm, flickering glow across the garden, and the soft hum of conversations, muted now by the lateness of the hour, filled the space. Most of the guests had left, leaving only a handful of family members and close friends scattered around the tables, lingering in their small circles, reluctant to end the evening. He was standing at the edge of the patio, a glass of wine in hand, his gaze drifting lazily over the few remaining guests. His wife was engaged in a conversation across the garden, her laughter carrying softly on the breeze. He should have been content, should have felt the comfort of familiarity and love after an evening spent among friends and family. But instead, a restlessness had settled over him. It had been weeks since the wedding, and in that time the unspoken tension between him and his brother-in-law had only grown. The silent understanding, the way their eyes would meet across the room with that same charge of forbidden desire, had become an almost unbearable presence at every family gathering. No words had been exchanged, no explicit acknowledgement of the undercurrent that ran between them, but it was there, undeniable, always just beneath the surface. Tonight was no different. He had felt it the moment his brother-in-law arrived. The subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way his body reacted instinctively, as if on high alert. He had tried to keep his distance, to focus on his wife, on the conversations, on anything but the man who seemed to occupy his every thought. But it was futile. Each glance, each casual interaction only fueled the fire that had been smoldering inside him for weeks. And now, as the evening drew to a close, the tension had reached a tipping point. He knew deep down that something was going to happen tonight. Something inevitable, something that would cross the line they had both been tiptoeing around for so long. The air felt thick with anticipation, as though the very night itself was holding its breath, waiting. His brother-in-law appeared in the periphery of his vision, moving through the garden with that same easy grace, the nonchalance that had first drawn him in. He wasn't part of any of the lingering conversations. Instead, he moved quietly, almost as if he were waiting too. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that glance, everything was laid bare. The time for pretending was over. Without thinking, the man set his glass down on the edge of the table and began to move through the garden, his footsteps almost soundless on the soft grass. He didn't need to look to know that his brother-in-law had done the same, that he was following, keeping just enough distance between them to avoid suspicion, but not enough to break the invisible thread that pulled them toward each other. He felt his pulse quicken, his skin tingling with the awareness that they were alone now, that the rest of the world had faded into the background, leaving only this moment, this tension that had built to a breaking point. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation swirling together in a heady, intoxicating rush. He didn't know what was going to happen, but he knew that there was no turning back. Not now. He found himself standing at the edge of the property, where the garden gave way to a small, secluded patio area, tucked away behind a wall of hedges. The sounds of the party had faded almost completely, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of voices. It was quiet here, private, a perfect hiding place for what was about to unfold. His brother-in-law was only a few steps behind him now. The man could feel the heat of his presence, the tension between them palpable in the cool night air. He didn't turn around, he didn't need to. Instead, he stood still, his back to him, his breath shallow and uneven as he waited. The moment stretched out, heavy and unbearable, until finally, he felt it. So light at first, he almost thought he had imagined it. The soft brush of fingers against his wrist. A tentative, almost accidental touch, as though testing the waters, seeing if the man would pull away. But he didn't. He couldn't. The touch lingered. And then, slowly, his brother-in-law's fingers curled around his wrist, gently, deliberately, as though claiming something that had been left unspoken for too long. The man felt his breath hitch, his heart racing in his chest as he stood frozen in place, every nerve in his body alive with sensation. The touch was light, barely there, but it set his skin on fire, sending a wave of heat rushing through him that left him dizzy, unsteady on his feet. He could feel the warmth of his brother-in-law's body now, standing so close behind him that he could almost hear the quiet rhythm of his breath. The world seemed to narrow to this one moment, this one touch, and nothing else mattered. All the fear, the guilt, the impossibility of it melted away, leaving only the raw, undeniable desire that had been building between them for so long. And the man didn't move. He didn't turn around. He couldn't bring himself to break the fragile spell that had settled over them. Instead, he closed his eyes, allowing himself to sink into the sensation, to give in to the pull he had been fighting for weeks. His brother-in-law's hand slid up his arm, slow and deliberate, until it rested on his shoulder. The touch was still so light, so careful, but it felt like everything. The culmination of weeks of silent yearning, of stolen glances and unspoken desires. The man let out a shaky breath, his body leaning ever so slightly into the touch, his resolve crumbling with every passing second. He could feel his brother-in-law's breath on the back of his neck now, warm and soft, sending shivers down his spine. There was no going back. The first touch had broken the barrier, and now all that was left was the inevitability of what came next. His brother-in-law's hand tightened ever so slightly on his shoulder, as though grounding him, anchoring him in this moment. The man swallowed hard, his heart racing in his chest, the weight of the desire between them pressing down like a physical force. He wanted to turn around, to face him, to close the space between them, but he couldn't move. He was caught in the gravity of the moment, paralyzed by the intensity of what was happening. And then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, his brother-in-law's hand moved again, sliding down the length of his arm, tracing the contours of his muscles with a tenderness that made the man's breath catch in his throat. It was such a simple touch, but it carried with it the weight of everything they had left unsaid, everything they had denied themselves. When his hand finally reached his, their fingers intertwined without hesitation, as if this was where they had always belonged. The man's pulse raced, his entire body thrumming with the electricity of that first, forbidden touch, and in that moment, nothing else existed. No fear, no guilt, no consequences, only the raw, undeniable connection between them. They stood like that for what felt like an eternity, their fingers tangled together, the quiet night wrapping around them like a cocoon. The man's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts swirling through his head, but he pushed them all away, focusing only on the warmth of his brother-in-law's hand in his, the feel of his skin against his own. Finally, after what felt like hours, the man turned slowly, carefully, until he was face to face with him. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything fell away. The pretense, the fear, the lies they had told themselves. All that remained was the truth of what they both wanted, what they had wanted all along. The affair began as a quiet ripple, almost imperceptible amidst the flow of daily life. After that first touch, the boundaries they had so carefully maintained had crumbled, leaving only the raw intensity of their unspoken desire. Yet, despite the passion that consumed them, everything remained hidden beneath a thin veneer of normalcy. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic moments of revelation, just a silent understanding, a shared secret that bound them together in ways both exhilarating and suffocating. The first time they met in secret, it was under the guise of something ordinary, a family errand that required them both to step away from the gathering for a few hours. No one questioned it. Why would they? They were family now, brothers-in-law, tied together by marriage and the expectations that came with it. The lie was easy, and perhaps that was the most dangerous part. The ease with which they slipped into this new reality, one where every moment stolen from the world felt like a small rebellion. The place they chose was inconspicuous, a small park just outside the city where the trees stood tall and dense, their branches forming a canopy that offered a sense of protection, of isolation. They didn't speak much when they arrived. There was no need. The silence between them was enough, filled with the weight of everything they couldn't say. At first, they just walked, side by side, their hands occasionally brushing against each other, the air between them heavy with anticipation. It wasn't until they were deep in the woods, far from any prying eyes, that they finally allowed themselves to touch again. It was tentative at first, a hand on his shoulder, fingers tracing the line of his arm. But soon, the restraint they had so carefully maintained began to crack, and the intensity of their desire flooded to the surface. The man could still feel the imprint of that first touch, the way it had set his skin on fire, the way it had made him feel alive in a way he hadn't realized he was missing. And now here they were again, bodies pressed together in the quiet of the forest, the world falling away as their lips met in a desperate, urgent kiss. There was no room for doubt in those moments, no room for the guilt that would inevitably follow. All that existed was the heat between them, the sheer force of their attraction pulling them together, even as they knew they were dancing on the edge of disaster. Time lost its meaning when they were together. Every encounter was like a fever dream, an intoxicating blur of hands and lips, of skin pressed against skin, of whispered breaths and stolen moments. They would meet whenever they could, finding excuses to slip away from the eyes of family and friends. Sometimes it was just a few minutes stolen in a darkened hallway at a family gathering, their fingers brushing as they passed each other, the promise of something more lingering in the air. Other times, they would find themselves alone in more secluded places, places where they could let go of the pretense and give in to the desire that had been consuming them for weeks. The affair became their secret world, one that existed in parallel to the lives they lived for everyone else. It was a world of stolen glances across crowded rooms, of hands brushing under the table at family dinners, of breathless moments hidden behind closed doors. They learned to speak in silence, to communicate with a look, a touch, a shared understanding that no one else could see. The tension between them grew thicker with each encounter, the line between what was real and what was forbidden becoming increasingly blurred. But with each secret meeting, the weight of their actions began to press down harder. The man found himself living two lives, one with his wife, where everything seemed normal on the surface, and another with her brother, where nothing was certain except the fire that burned between them. He became adept at hiding his emotions, at masking the guilt that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He would wake in the middle of the night, his heart pounding in his chest, torn between the life he had chosen and the one he had stumbled into, a life defined by passion and secrecy. At home, his wife began to notice subtle changes. He was more distant, more distracted, and though she couldn't pinpoint the source of his unease, the growing rift between them was undeniable. She would ask if everything was all right, her voice soft with concern, and he would smile, assure her that everything was fine, even as the lie settled heavily on his tongue. He loved her, or at least he thought he did. But whatever love had once existed between them had been eclipsed by the intensity of what he now felt for her brother. Each time he met his brother-in-law, the guilt swelled inside him, threatening to consume him. Yet the moment they were alone, that guilt evaporated, replaced by the rush of desire, the overwhelming need to be close to him. It was a cycle: guilt, desire, guilt, desire. Each emotion feeding the other, trapping him in a web of contradictions from which he couldn't escape. The secrecy only heightened the thrill, making every stolen moment feel like a small rebellion against the world they inhabited. Their encounters became more frequent, more reckless. They would meet in places where the risk of being caught was higher, where the possibility of discovery only added to the allure. Once, they slipped away during a family gathering, sneaking out to a secluded part of the garden where the hedges offered just enough cover to hide them from view. The man could still hear the distant sound of laughter from the parties they pressed against each other, their breaths ragged, their hands moving with the kind of urgency that came from knowing their time was limited. Each time they parted, the man was left with a hollow ache in his chest, a sense of longing that grew stronger with every passing day. The affair had become the center of his world, and though he knew it couldn't last, he couldn't bring himself to stop. His brother-in-law had become an addiction, one he couldn't break, no matter how much it threatened to unravel his life. And yet, despite the intensity of their relationship, they rarely spoke about it. There were no declarations of love, no discussions of what the future might hold. It was as if acknowledging the reality of their situation would somehow shatter the fragile world they had built. Instead, they lived in the moment, taking what they could from each other without asking for more. The silence between them was both a comfort and a curse. It allowed them to exist in their secret world without the burden of expectations, but it also left them vulnerable, each of them haunted by the unspoken knowledge that this couldn't last. Every kiss, every touch, was tinged with the awareness that they were living on borrowed time, that eventually the world would come crashing in and their secret would be exposed. As the affair continued, the man began to wonder how long they could keep it hidden, how long they could maintain the facade of normalcy, of family, before something or someone gave them away. The fear of discovery was always there, lurking in the back of his mind, but it was a fear he had learned to push aside, to bury beneath the overwhelming pull of desire, the secrecy, the guilt, the passion. It was all part of the dance they had been performing for weeks now, a dance that neither of them knew how to stop. And though the man knew that their affair was unsustainable, that eventually the weight of it would crush them both, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. Because despite everything, despite the lies and the guilt and the fear of what was to come, the affair had become the one thing in his life that felt real. The cracks began subtly, as such things often do. In the beginning, there was no dramatic shift, no sudden argument, or clear indication that the foundation of the marriage was starting to fracture. It was more like a slow erosion, a quiet unraveling that happened in the small moments, almost imperceptible at first. Life went on as it always had. Dinners together, social engagements, lazy Sundays spent in each other's company. But something had changed. The rhythm of their relationship, once steady and familiar, now felt offbeat, disjointed. He noticed it in the way his wife would reach for his hand at the dinner table, only for him to pull away, almost reflexively, without thinking. It was a small gesture, a harmless one, but the way her fingers hovered for a moment in the empty space between them, before retreating, told him that she had felt the distance. She didn't say anything, though. She never did. She simply smiled, continuing the conversation as if nothing had happened. But the silence between them, the unspoken gulf that had begun to grow, was impossible to ignore. The man had become an expert in pretending. He had to be. Every day, he woke up next to his wife, smiled at her, kissed her, told her he loved her. He played the role of the devoted husband, the partner who was fully present in their shared life. But beneath that surface, a storm was brewing. His thoughts, his emotions, were constantly pulled elsewhere, to his brother-in-law, to the forbidden affair that had consumed him so completely. It was as if he were living two lives, each one demanding more of him than he had to give. He would catch himself staring at her sometimes, wondering when the distance had become so pronounced. He hadn't meant for this to happen. He had married her with the best of intentions, with love, or at least what he had thought was love. But now, in the quiet moments between them, the weight of his deception felt suffocating. Every smile, every shared meal, was laced with the knowledge that he was betraying her, that the life they had built together was slowly slipping away from him. The physical distance between them was the first real sign of the cracks. It started with small things, the way he would turn away from her in bed, the way he would flinch slightly when she tried to be affectionate. She noticed, of course. How could she not? Her attempts at intimacy became more tentative, more measured, as though she were trying to navigate an invisible barrier she couldn't quite understand. She would reach for him, and he would pull away, leaving her with a look of quiet confusion in her eyes. Though she never voiced her concerns, nights spent together became increasingly rare. He found excuses to stay late at work, to leave early in the mornings, filling his time with anything that kept him away from home. The more he avoided her, the easier it became to justify the distance, even as a part of him knew that it was only making things worse. He didn't want to confront the reality of what he was doing, the damage he was causing, so he buried himself in distractions, hoping that the cracks wouldn't deepen into something irreparable. But the cracks did deepen. Conversations between them grew stilted, awkward. The easy flow of words that had once come naturally was replaced by strained silences, by small talk that felt more like an obligation than a genuine exchange. They spoke about mundane things, dinners, schedules, social events, never addressing the growing distance that was slowly hollowing out their marriage from the inside. His wife began to change as well. She became quieter, more withdrawn, as though she were retreating into herself in response to the walls he had started to build around him. He noticed how she lingered in doorways, her gaze following him with a sadness she couldn't quite hide. She was searching for something in him, some sign that he was still there, still the man she had married. But he wasn't. Not really. Not anymore. And yet, she didn't confront him. There were no accusations, no dramatic outbursts. She simply waited, hoping that the distance between them was temporary, that he would come back to her. But the man knew better. The more time he spent away from her, the more entangled he became in his affair with her brother. The more he realized that the marriage he had once been committed to was slipping further out of reach. The weight of the lies began to press down on him, suffocating in their enormity. Every time he sat at the dinner table with his wife, every time he walked through the door and saw her smile at him, unaware of the betrayal that had taken root in their lives, he felt the cracks deepening. He was living in a house of glass, fragile and transparent, and he knew that it would only take one small push for everything to come crashing down. The tension between them became unbearable at times. There were moments when he would catch her watching him, her eyes filled with questions she didn't know how to ask. She had become a stranger to him in so many ways, not because she had changed, but because he had. His guilt gnawed at him, but it wasn't enough to stop. He couldn't stop. The affair had become an addiction, a lifeline to something that felt more real than the marriage he was now only pretending to be a part of. He tried, on occasion, to be present for her. There were nights when he would sit with her on the couch, their legs touching but their minds miles apart. He would hold her hand, feeling the softness of her skin, and tell himself that he could make this work, that he could salvage what was left of their relationship. But every time he tried, the memory of his brother-in-law would pull him away, the illicit desire that had come to define him overpowering any sense of duty or guilt. The man found himself trapped in a cycle of guilt and desire, unable to break free from either. He wanted to be a good husband, to live up to the promises he had made on their wedding day, but he also wanted the intensity of the affair, the rush of being with someone who made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. The duality of his existence was tearing him apart, and yet he couldn't bring himself to choose one life over the other. As the months passed, the cracks in the marriage became more visible. His wife, once patient and understanding, began to withdraw further into herself. Her attempts to reach out to him grew less frequent, and the man knew that she was beginning to lose hope. The distance between them had become a chasm, one that neither of them knew how to bridge, and still he did nothing. The affair continued, a secret life that ran parallel to the one he shared with his wife, both of them sustained by the lies he told himself and the people around him. He became skilled at compartmentalizing, at separating the parts of his life that couldn't coexist. But the cracks were always there, deepening with each passing day, threatening to shatter the fragile balance he had tried so hard to maintain. He knew deep down that it couldn't last. The lies, the secrecy, the affair, it was all unsustainable. But for now, he continued to live in the space between two worlds, unwilling to confront the reality of what he had done. The cracks in his marriage were growing wider, and soon, he knew, they would be impossible to ignore. But until that day came, he would continue pretending, hoping that somehow, against all odds, the pieces wouldn't fall apart. The day of reckoning had arrived, though neither of them had spoken about it directly. It was as if the weight of everything they had been avoiding had finally grown too heavy to bear, pressing down on both of them, forcing a decision that could no longer be postponed. There was no specific event that had led to this moment. No confrontation, no discovery, no single spark that ignited the inevitable. It had simply been building, quietly, inexorably, the way an approaching storm gathers on the horizon, darkening the sky bit by bit until there is no escaping its arrival. The man found himself sitting alone in the kitchen one evening, staring blankly at the remnants of dinner, his mind far from the mundane scene before him. His wife had long since gone to bed, her presence a quiet ghost that haunted the corners of their house. She had stopped asking where he was when he came home late, stopped questioning the growing silence between them. It was as if she had resigned herself to the distance that had settled between them, accepting it as an inevitable part of their lives. And perhaps it was. The marriage, once vibrant and full of hope, had become something hollow, a structure that still stood but had long since lost its purpose. He felt trapped, not by his wife or even by the marriage itself, but by the impossible situation he had created. His heart was torn in two directions, neither of which offered an easy escape. On one side, there was his wife, the woman he had once loved, the woman he had built a life with, even if that life now felt like a distant memory. On the other side was his brother-in-law, the forbidden lover who had ignited something in him that he hadn't even known was there. The affair had been thrilling, intoxicating, but it had also become a source of anguish, a constant reminder of the man he no longer recognized. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark garden beyond. The night was still eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a choice. The thought of ending the affair was unbearable, like cutting off a part of himself, yet continuing it seemed just as impossible. The guilt had become too much to ignore, seeping into every aspect of his life until he could no longer pretend that he wasn't drowning in it. But the guilt was only part of the problem. The real issue, the thing that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling in silent torment, was the knowledge that no matter what he chose, someone would be hurt. He couldn't have both worlds. The affair had made that clear. And now, standing on the precipice, he knew that the time for indecision was over. He had to choose. His mind drifted back to the last time he had seen his brother-in-law. It had been only a few days ago, yet it felt like a lifetime. They had met in secret as they always did, sneaking away to a secluded spot outside the city, where they could be alone, away from the eyes of family and society. The encounter had been intense, filled with the same passion that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. But beneath the desire, there had been something else, something darker, a sense of finality perhaps, or the weight of what was coming. Neither of them had spoken about it, but it was there, hanging in the air between them like an unspoken truth. Afterward, they had sat in silence, the warmth of their bodies slowly fading as reality crept back in. The man had wanted to say something, to ask his lover what they were going to do, but the words had stuck in his throat. It was easier to stay silent, to pretend that they could go on like this forever, even though they both knew it was a lie. The affair couldn't continue. It was unsustainable. Sooner or later, it would destroy them both. Now, standing in the darkness of his kitchen, the man felt the weight of that truth pressing down on him with full force. The affair had reached its breaking point. There was no more pretending, no more hiding. Emptying, the time for secrecy had passed, and now he was left with an impossible choice: end the affair and try to rebuild the life he had once known, or leave his wife and face the consequences of a love that defied every rule of society and family. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine a future without his brother-in-law. It was a bleak vision, a life drained of color and meaning, passion, the intensity, the connection. They were unlike anything he'd ever experienced, and the thought of losing that, of returning to the empty routine of his marriage, filled him with a deep, aching sense of loss. How could he walk away from something that had come to define him so completely? But then there was his wife. He could still remember the early days of their relationship, the way they had laughed together, the way they had built their life with hope and love. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to be lied to be betrayed. He had promised to be her partner, her support, and now he had failed her in the worst possible way. The guilt of that betrayal gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the man he had become, a man he barely recognized. The dilemma wasn't just about choosing between two people. It was about choosing between two versions of himself. One was the man who had built a life with his wife, the man who had once believed in the promises he had made. The other was the man who had found a connection with someone who wasn't supposed to be his, a connection that had reawakened something deep within him, but had also thrown his life into chaos. Both lives offered something precious, but both also carried unbearable costs. The silence in the house felt oppressive, as if the very walls were waiting for him to make his decision. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned against the counter, his mind spinning in circles, chasing after answers that refused to come. No matter how many times he played out the scenarios in his head, there was no outcome that didn't end in pain. His wife would be devastated if she knew the truth, and his brother-in-law. Well, he wasn't sure what would happen if they tried to make their relationship public. It would destroy their family. That much was certain. The scandal would ripple through every part of their lives, leaving nothing untouched. He wondered, not for the first time, if his brother-in-law felt the same torment. They had never spoken about the future, had never allowed themselves to consider what might come next. But now, standing at the edge of the abyss, he couldn't help but wonder what his lover wanted. Did he feel the same desperation, the same fear of losing what they had? Or had he already resigned himself to the fact that this affair, no matter how passionate, was doomed from the start? The man ran a hand through his hair, his chest tightening with the weight of indecision. He couldn't keep living like this. The double life, the lies, the constant fear of being discovered. It was tearing him apart. He had to choose, but the choice felt impossible. How could he give up his brother-in-law, the person who had reignited a fire in his soul? But how could he stay in the affair and continue to hurt his wife, the woman who had trusted him, who had built a life with him? As the hours stretched on, the man remained frozen in place, the ultimate dilemma hanging over him like a sword. No matter which path he chose, he would lose something vital. And in the quiet darkness of his home, with the weight of his choices pressing down on him, he finally understood that there was no right answer. There was only the painful truth that love, in all its forms, demanded sacrifices, and no matter which sacrifice he made, it would cost him everything.